Good afternoon, and welcome to the Michigan Department of Education's Teaching Comprehensive History webinar series. I am Delsa Chapman, Deputy Superintendent of the Division of Assessment, School Improvement, and System Support. The Michigan Department of Education encourages teachers to lean into teaching the rich and diverse history of our country and world. The presentation you will see today intends to provide educators additional perspectives, knowing that as educators expand their knowledge, they will be better able to create lessons that help students meaningfully engage with history. We are proud to work with institutions of higher education, cultural centers, and the Confederation of Michigan Tribal Education Departments, bringing their research and expertise directly to Michigan educators. Today, we are fortunate to welcome Dr. Kelli Morgan. Dr. Morgan is the Senior Curator at the Charles H. Wright Museum of African American History in Detroit, Michigan. The presentation you will experience today investigates dominant perspectives within American art and visual culture, demonstrates how traditional art history and museum practice upholds systems of power, privilege, and positionality.
Teaching Comprehensive History webinars are intended to lift the knowledge of educators so that in turn you may provide opportunities for students to inquire, think critically, and explore history from multiple perspectives you may have not heard before. As you listen today, you are invited to explore these opportunities to take new learning, insights, and ideas to your communities. As shared, Dr. Kelli Morgan is the Senior Curator at Charles H. Wright Museum of African American History in Detroit. Dr. Morgan's investigation of dominant perspectives within American art and visual culture demonstrates how traditional art history and museum practice uphold systems of power, privilege, and personality. Besides her own curatorial experience, Dr. Morgan mentors emerging curators and regularly trains staff at various museums to foster best practices in collection management, exhibitions, community engagement, and fundraising. A leading and influential voice in furthering museum practice, Dr. Morgan has previously held curatorial positions at the Indianapolis Museum of Art at Newfields and Birmingham Museum of Art and the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts. Welcome, Dr. Morgan.
Thank you, Scott. Can everybody hear me? That's good. Good. Well, good evening. Well, early evening, late afternoon to everybody. Thank you for being here. I hope the weather is good and is safe wherever you are in the state right now. I had to thank Dr. Garcia and Dr. Chapman for the invitation. It's always a pleasure to spend time talking to teachers, and particularly talking about areas, events, individuals of Black history with teachers who actually disseminate that information, to our future generations. I'm super excited about this because today I'm actually talking about one of my favorite moments and movements in African American history. We like to say here at the Wright, and just in Black studies in general, that African American history is American history, right? You want or in interest, right, of actually teaching broader narratives in sharing with students things from American historical moments that they can identify themselves in. Cultural history is where you're going to find that, right, most succinctly. And my presentation today is on one of my favorite texts from the Harlem Renaissance, Jean Toomer's Cane. So let me share my screen. So typically when, you hear about the Harlem Renaissance, I always like to say you hear about it in a very bifurcated way. So you typically hear about the visual artists, or you hear about the literary artists and the performing artists, right? You never really hear about the conglomerate, right? Or the diverse group of artists together. So this is why this presentation is entitled A Shared Existence, because they worked together in like every sort of facet, of their art. And I start with this image because this is an image of Charles Austin, who is the light-skinned man in sort of the back middle. And he was really a key person, just really a type of glue for Harlem Renaissance artists. And they're standing outside of his Harlem studio, which was at 306 141st Street. And this was the place to be for Harlem Renaissance artists, visual artists, writers, literary artists, performing artists, as well as the athletes. So if you are familiar with the Harlem Renaissance, or you're familiar with the generation of Black artists after, 306 is the place that Romare Bearden had his first show, right? 306 is the place that Jacob Lawrence learns how to paint, right? Studies with Augusta Savage. It was a place that all the writers hung out in. So this woman right here, fair skinned Black woman in the forefront of the painting is actually the writer Gwendolyn Bennett. And so this idea, that the artists kind of worked in silos or worked in vacuums has never really been true, right? Even though the Harlem Renaissance is often taught in that way. Next slide. So I wanted to really begin and to kind of ground us in like what's happening in the country, what's happening in the world that allows, right, for the Harlem Renaissance to happen. First of all, it's called the Harlem Renaissance because the arts, sort of America was sort of branding itself as an arts, as a center, right, for international arts. But this momentum, around Black arts was happening in all urban centers across the country. So Detroit, Philadelphia, Washington, D.C., Pittsburgh, right, you name it, you can find, right, the artists who were participating. But prior to the 1920s, the Harlem Renaissance really originates with what's called the New Negro movement. So the New Negro movement is a social and intellectual movement among African Americans at the end of the 19th century. The two major voices, in that movement was W.E.B. Du Bois as well as Booker T. Washington. So people may know, Du Bois's name as, one of the preeminent Black scholars of the 20th century, probably most prominently, due to his founding or co-founding of the NAACP in 1909. And Booker T. Washington, on the other hand, being the other prominent name there as the founder of Tuskegee Institute in Alabama. Okay, so why is this important? The New Negro was a persona that Blacks claimed for themselves, right? Prior to this moment, all visual or the prominent visual representation of Black folks across the country, and like I said, around the world, was pretty racist, right? The Little Black Sambo books, right, got around, Uncle Remus tales, right, that kind of thing. So you have the Uncle Tom and the Sambo and the Mammy and the Jezebel are these, pretty racist, discriminatory representations that are being presented as truth, right? As visual truth, that this is how Black people actually look. And this is how Black people act. And that was never the case. It was never the case during slavery. It definitely wasn't the case after. So Black people really take to photography in about the 1850s, right? To usurp this reality, of being discriminated against visually. And the plethora, of Black photographs or photographs of Black families and Black communities that find themselves into cultural institutions and in collections even in the 19th century, but shared within communities themselves, sort of dawns on Du Bois. And he's, saying to himself, okay, this is something that we actually need to get out there. So beyond the photographs, right, you get poetry, you get short stories, you get paintings, you get sculpture, you get music, right? Different dance moves, all types of things sort of grow out of this, right? So the idea that the Harlem Renaissance is like this one-off of an event that happens in the cultural spaces in urban centers in the United States is also not necessarily true. It was an international movement. Next slide. So here are some of the things that, are happening, both during and before the Harlem Renaissance that make it such an important moment in American history. So you have the Great Migration, which I'll talk about a little bit more in a minute. Of course, you have World War I, right? So what's happening during World War I is a lot of European immigrants are then called back home, right, to fight in the war. So that leaves a gap in American industry, particularly in the northern centers. So companies, even some unions, send recruiters to the South to recruit particularly Black men, right, to be strike breakers, right, or to work on the lines. So this is the first time that Black people are being introduced into northern industrial jobs ever, you know. So that then gives Black people like a little bit more of an economic and socio-political upward mobility that didn't really exist en masse before the end of slavery. In 1919, Marcus Garvey founds the UNIA. And again, you know, the publishing happens. So Langston Hughes publishes The Negro Speaks, and Jean Toomer publishes Cane. You can skip the next slide, Scott, and go to the slide after that. So Toomer is super important because he's born in DC and he's the grandson. Next slide, I'm gonna need you to toggle between these two slides, Scott. He's the grandson of Pinckney Benton Stewart Pinchback. Okay, so who is this guy, right? He's primarily known as PBS Pinchback, and he's the first African-American lieutenant governor in the US in during Reconstruction, so 1870, 1865, 66. He had been a Union soldier during the Civil War, and then he later served as the acting governor, so the first Black governor, right, of Louisiana, a southern state, during the Reconstruction period. So when you talk about Reconstruction, right, there's this conversation of it was this really terrible time in the US, particularly for Southern landowners. The part that history doesn't often tell you about Reconstruction is that it was actually working for Black folks, right? So you had people like Pinchback that was in state government, but then you also had the integration of both the US Congress and the US Senate. So we had like 12, it's either 12 or 13 Black US congressmen, all of Southern states in the Reconstruction period, and one, Hiram Revels, who was the one Black senator. So again, this idea that I like to call it bullet point history. You know, sometimes when we think about African-American history, it's like, first of all, it only happens in February, right? And it's this sentiment of on this one day, this one great Black person does this one great thing. And that's not how history happens at all. And it's also not how, you know, Black people have existed in this country over the last 300 years. So Toomer is the grandson of Mr. Pinchback, right? So he actually sees, you know, what the value and what the possibilities are for Black people in the United States, both in the North and the South. So you can go back to the previous slide, Scott. As a poet and a playwright and a novelist, Toomer's most famous work is Cane, is published in 1923, and is hailed by American literary critics as the most important experimentation and portrayal of African-American culture. So again, why is this important? This is the height of American modernism. So you have people in the art world like Duchamp and Georgia O'Keeffe, Charles DeMuth, Alfred Stieglitz, right, that are like leading this charge of American modernism. And in the literary area, you have people like T.S. Eliot and Tennyson and Fitzgerald, right? Those writers who are kind of like the forefathers, right, of this new way of presenting American literature. And then Toomer, you know, shows up on the scene and kind of writes circles, right, around the more prominent, i.e. meaning white male, American writers. As a child, Toomer attended both all Black and all white segregated schools, right? So he could pass for white, like you can kind of see that. So from a very early age, he had this very sophisticated understanding of race and refused to be classified by race. So could you imagine like a 10-year-old in 1916 telling you that they're not Black or white, they're simply American. And that was Toomer's like sentiment. That was the way that he identified himself. His mother was Black, his father was white. His father like left the house right before he turned 5. So to be, I'm like just thinking about this, like particularly as teachers, right? It's like to be a kid, right? And to be navigating this kind of what we typically think to be like very difficult subject matter or very difficult realities. He was very aware, as many of your students are, and I don't think we always give students that credit, right? Particularly if they're not high school students. And so that really informed how he moved through the world and how he moved through his career. In 22, he moved to Georgia, Sparta, Georgia, actually, to become a high school principal. And it was from here, right, that he really started to dig into what he felt was the wealth as well as the beauty in the harsh realities of the South. Like most artists creating during the Renaissance, he's working diligently, right, to express, again, the realities of the South, because it's very much so a double-sided coin, particularly for Black folks. So the book starts out, if you have an actual paper copy, of Kane, it really starts out with these arcs, right? The book is broken up, or he breaks the book up into 3 different parts. So it starts in the South, you move north, and then the two kind of come together. Before each section, there's this arc. And the reason, why he delineates it like that, or why he organizes it in that way, is because it's not just this sentiment that the Black experience, right, comes full circle, right, but that the human experience comes full circle. And more importantly, is that the Black experience is a human experience, right? So he's trying very specifically to decenter whiteness as the universal norm. So the book begins with a poem called Corintha. And Corintha is this from a little girl, he kind of chronicles, I shouldn't say a poem, it's actually a short story. But he kind of chronicles her life. And from a little girl to a grown woman, she is this thing that is almost more beautiful than God, right? Right. And for Toomer, that was what the South represented for him. So the story starts out, her skin is like dusk on the eastern horizon. Oh, can't you see it? Can't you see it? Her skin is like dusk on the eastern horizon when the sun goes down. Next slide. So for Toomer, the South doubles as a Black woman. It's a fertile space, right? This is, again, 20 years after the post-Reconstruction period. So it's a fertile space for both Black Americans and white Americans. It's a fertile space for, even more importantly, right, in the 1920s, is Northern industry, right? But for Toomer, it was a vested interest in how Black women really drove industry and drove, again, economic and sociopolitical mobility for the Black community, right? So it starts with Corintha as a little girl, and as you move through the first section of the text, right, it's like the Black female figure grows up. I include Laura Wheeler Waring here because she's also one of Toomer's contemporaries. And she's painting Black women most prominently, in her work. The point of this, again, is this centrality, right, of the Black female figure. So we're domestics, we're washerwomen, but we are also, right, in the factories. The Black washerwoman is actually the first American female icon prior to Rosie the Riveter, right? And so again, when you're teaching, right, these ideas of like the working woman, and even the new woman, those ideas and those images really begin, right, with Black women. And this image is really, I think, important because Waring softens her sitter, right? So this I think painting is so important because it's a study, right? It's not an actual it wasn't the finished product, right? So she's working through these things. And the fact that this sitter is also a dark-skinned woman. Positive representation of brown-skinned women, right? And darker-skinned Black women during this time in the country was almost exclusively negative, right? So for Toomer to compare Corintha in her skin in particular, right, to the eastern horizon when the sun goes down, what does the eastern horizon look like when the sun goes down? Right, those pinks, those purples, those oranges are central to Laura Wheeler Waring's character here, right? Not just in her dress, but actually her skin tone. So there's also this sense, of saying that visually, as Black women, we are connected to nature, right? And not just as women who reproduce, as the slavery and both sort of post-slavery narrative would have you believe. Next slide. This is a piece by Charles Austin, the artist I mentioned earlier, who's also one of Toomer's contemporaries. Similar theme, right? Dark-skinned woman in a very serious visage, right? She has a very serious look on her face. And why, right? Is she so serious? Is she so determined? Next slide. The reason is because when you're on this journey as a Black person in the 1920s, 19 teens, right, from South to North, again, like I said, it's a very two-sided coin. So there's a softness and there's a beauty to the South, but there's also a very really real, hard, violent, right, dangerous, even deathly reality. And Toomer tells us a little bit about that in the first section of Cain through reapers, right? So reapers goes, Black reapers with the sound of steel on stones are sharpening scythes. I see them place the hones in their hip pockets as a thing that's done and start their silence swinging one by one. Black horses drive a mower through the weeds, and there a field rat, startled, squealing, bleeds. His belly close to the ground, I see the blade, bloodstained, continuing cutting weeds and shade, weeds and shade. Next slide. So, okay, what does this mean? When you we can sort of wax poetic about the realities of the beauty of a landscape, or beauty of a sunset in Eastern Georgia, right, in 1923. But the actual reality in terms of what are people living out day to day on the ground, right, is a not so beautiful situation, right? It's hard work. It's toil beyond, one's own physical capacity in certain cases. And the products, economic as well as agricultural, that labor produces is not actually coming back, right, into the laborer's hands, right? So imagine you working all day, we used to say, we work from can't see to can't see, right? So you teach from before the sun comes up until the sun goes down again, but you never see any money, right? You never see any resources from all that teaching that you're doing. That was sharecropping, right, for Black folks during this time. So you have an artist like William H. Johnson, who can be considered a major American artist, even at this time. He produces 100, or hundreds of works that are very, virtuosic, right, and esoteric and eclectic in a career that was international. So like I said earlier, the Harlem Renaissance was an international movement. It wasn't just located to Harlem. So Johnson, who is, this handsome figure down here in the right-hand corner, born in South Carolina to a poor African-American family. He moved to New York at 17, worked a variety of jobs, saved money, and got an education at the National Academy of Design. The mastery, right, of his work and academic standards won him numerous awards, right? So he winds up moving to France, meets his wife, right? And they live in Switzerland, right? And well, across Scandinavia for the better part of like 10, 15 years. So as he's doing that, right, he's studying with, the European modernists, from the Impressionists to the German Expressionists. And there's this constant conversation about primitivism. That's another lecture, so I won't go deep into that. But primitivism, is this idea that, African, quote unquote, primitive design is the most kind of purest sense, of visual expression. So as Johnson is, mulling over this, like as he's learning it and studying it, like it's in Netherlands and in Germany and in France and Italy, he's thinking back to his own roots, right? He's thinking back to South Carolina. And he's seeing things that he recognizes, so instead of staying in Europe, and even staying on European subject matter, much like Toomer, he comes back to the American South. And so you have an image like this, which is called sowing, right? Toomer's poem is called Reapers. And you kind of have to do both, right? When you're sharecropping and working land. But he flattens the plane, right? So he uses line and he uses color, right? To give us a very flat sense, and I would say like heavy sense of how the reality of sharecropping affects Black people, right? But there's still a beauty kind of in that struggle. If you look at the way that he uses line, in terms of the fields in the back, right, and the juxtaposition of yellow and brown, and they almost kind of look like, right, prison bars. Next slide. The reason why that is because just as much as sharecropping was this sort of cyclical form of economic oppression, right? So no matter how much you worked the land, like it was called debt peonage, right? Like you were never going to actually get out of debt because the white landowner was always going to come up with some other thing that you owed. The sister form of discrimination that functioned in conjunction with sharecropping to reestablish Jim Crow segregation in the South was called convict leasing. Right. So here's another piece by Johnson called Chain Gang that speaks to that reality. So this whole idea that Toomer asserts about, this sort of cutting and bleeding was something that was happening very literally to Black men in the South as they were being kidnapped. Either, in terms of being like tenement farmers and like kind of transient looking for work, and then forced, to work on chain gangs for either reindustrializing farms or factories in the South. But most frankly, and I think most prominently was the railroads, right? And so there's a text, pretty old now, but it's called Slavery by Another Name, written by Douglas Blackman, that like outlines this history, because our current criminal justice system is actually based and still functions as a form of convict leasing, right? So the other thing that I will add to this about this moment in time, if you actually research the WPA narratives, you have just like hundreds of thousands of letters from Black women across the South from 1920 up until civil rights movement. So let's just say Montgomery bus boycott, 1955. And they're writing to every single president and saying, my son, left for school this morning, never came home. My husband, my uncle, my brother, my father left for work, right? Left for a neighbor's house, left for whatever they left for, and never came back. And part of that had to do with, again, Black men being transient, so they're on foot. The frivolous laws of sundown towns and those kind of things Black men were being forced, into these chain gangs and into what were called labor farms, right? So again, it's a reinscription or slavery by another name, right? The new name being Jim Crow segregation is being reinscribed across the South. So this is pretty heavy stuff, right? Pretty heavy subject matter. It gets a little heavier right here. One of the other, again, forms of like political terror and discrimination that is, I would say, like the extreme version of oppression that's happening across the South to Black folks is lynching, right? So you have sharecropping, debt peonage, convict leasing, and lynching. Toomer is witnessing all of this, as well as, Johnson, as well as some of the other artists I'll talk about in a minute. But in Portrait in Georgia, Toomer does something unprecedented. And I'm gonna just read this to you really quickly and just let you kind of, chew on it for a minute. So it starts hair braided chestnut, coiled like a lyncher's rope. Eye faggots, lips old scars, or the first red blisters. Breath, the last sweet scent of cane in her slim body, white as the ash of Black flesh after flame. And this is really, again, this is really hard subject matter, because basically what Toomer is doing is he writes a poem describing a lynching in action as a white woman in physicality. And the reason that he does that is because the justification for the lynching of Black men and women throughout the South at this time is the alleged rape, right, of white women. So here we're dealing with death, we're dealing with murder, you're dealing with rape, you're dealing with a lot of violence. And one way, right, to think about this or to relate it is to police brutality, right? Lynching is really the history, of police brutality in this country against Black communities. And again, it may be hard, right? It may be hard for students to kind of, or maybe sometimes even hard for you, right? Hard for us as teachers to talk about this stuff. But we have to think about the fact that there are sometimes kids in our classrooms who are living this reality, right? Who are living this out on a day-to-day basis. Next slide. So to visualize that and to visualize the heaviness of that reality, I typically pair that poem with this piece by Jacob Lawrence that's called After a Lynching, the Migration Quickened. Right. So what does he mean? So he's speaking primarily about the Great Migration, like one of the reasons why Black folks, are leaving the South in droves and as fast as they are. He, much like Johnson, right, flattens the plane. But for our purposes, as viewers, right, of this piece, Lawrence is flattening the plane from the top, right? Versus Johnson, who's flattening the plane from like on the Z-axis, right? From the front. The reason why Lawrence is flattening the plane from the top, because it's again, the heaviness of the reality of sharecropping, of convict leasing, of not knowing if your beautiful Black boy is gonna come home from school. Not today, not on Wednesday, right? Every day that you send him to school. There is no Black mother on this earth, in this country right now, that doesn't live with that fear every day still. Those are the things that make this work, right? Or make these things relevant, and valid. So from this female figure's back, right, you can see like how bent over she is, how downtrodden, right, she is, how exhausted she is, because every day that her son, her husband, her uncle, her brother walks through the door, it's a great moment, but it's a fleeting moment, because a white quote unquote authority figure, right, could take that blessing away from her in any day. So this is why the bowl on the side of the table, right, is sort of off kilter, because at any moment all things could fall apart. So this is difficult, for Toomer. This is really hard for him to digest. And I think to a certain degree, it's probably still hard for all of us, right, to digest again, 200 years later. But in doing so, like, he felt like he needed to, trying to choose my words properly. I wouldn't say like make it more beautiful, right? But like translate it, interpret it in an artistic way that we could access the beauty, right? And we could access the reality. So what you see here now is like what was really taking place in terms of the Great Migration and the reasons why African Americans left the South, but we left in droves. This was not the first time. Prior to the end of the Civil War, we like to talk a lot about, Black Union soldiers and the ability, right? Or sort of the turn or the tide that turned, once Black men were able to enlist in the Union Army. Again, a part of that history that isn't often taught is that becomes a thing, right? Black enlistment in the Union Army, as well as the Emancipation Proclamation, become a reality because self-emancipating African Americans were leaving their plantations in droves. And they were swelling Union Army camps as a strategy to force Lincoln to grant Black citizenship. So Lawrence is pulling on two histories. So he's pulling on that, or he's referencing, right, signifying that history through the visualization of this reality, right, of Black people leaving the South to the North in such, large amounts. But he's also referencing the history of the transatlantic slave trade, and particularly the slave castles. So if any of you are familiar with the Door of No Return at Goree Island, this is kind of what it looks like. Right. And what he's asking us to do as viewers is think about the way in which we're forced, right, through these really small windows into an ocean, into a future that we know nothing about, right, that happens to us, that we then take and reinvent and reutilize into a tool for like self-manifestation from nothing, right? And we do that, or did that. I think we still do that as Black folks pretty expertly. And so he really wants us to look at the ways, that a lot of times you hear us talk about it as, Black resilience, or maybe, Black girl magic, right, as a more contemporary term. But it's the way in which we sort of we make something out of nothing, right? We make a way out of no way. And that's what Black folks were really doing, at this time. You couldn't stay in the South, right? The North ain't necessarily the greatest place. Better than maybe a life in Harlem, a little bit better than a life in sort of central Mississippi, right? But discrimination is discrimination. Systemic racism is systemic racism. But because we go together, we're able to actually create a semblance, of the life we want. So in this Johnson painting, which is actually called The Breakdown, I love this painting because it's a Black family that is literally taking everything that they have, right? So you see like the kitchen table, on top of the car. And you see, again, that setting sun on the eastern horizon in the background. So there is a type of hope in one, leaving the South, but in two, like I said, making something new, right, out of what you have. Next, need to demonstrate the speed, right, the sort of swiftness with which we left, right? So the ways in which we left plantations, the ways in which we left the South, the ways in which we leave situations that don't benefit us present day, right? So this is also his commentary on modernist painting, right? As we move into the popularity of abstract expressionism. Next slide. And so you get a sense, of, again, hope and what life could be like. The other really important modernist form of African-American art at this time is jazz, right? So in this painting by Aaron Douglas, this is the last of a set of 4 murals that he did for the New York Public Library, where he's really looking at aspects of Negro life. And this is the last part, or the last piece in that mural series where, African Americans make it to the North. So we're climbing up. Instead of it being a ladder, he uses a cog, again, to reference and to signify industrialization. But if you look in the right-hand corner, it's like this sort of green, ghoulish, like smoky hands, right, that are there to kind of pull the Black figure back. And as much as this Black figure, right, is sort of climbing out of the South, so you can see he's barefoot, his pants legs, right, are torn, but on top, it's like a business shirt and a briefcase, right? So the figure is like in between two spaces, in between two lives. And then the central figure, right, is holding this saxophone, right? So again, African-American modernism. And directly underneath, right, the curve of the horn is the Statue of Liberty, right? And what did the Statue of Liberty mean to immigrants coming into New York City? What does it still mean, right? Just particularly to European immigrants, right, coming into New York City now, right? So Black folks, coming into Harlem, the idea is that it's a new day. So this is why you have the concentric circles that also kind of represent, the sun. So the second half of Kane is where Toomer is really looking at the North, right? So here's an excerpt from 7th Street. So he says, money burns the pocket hurts. Bootleggers in silken shirts, balloon zooming Cadillacs, whizzing down the streetcar tracks. Next slide. So this is to really demonstrate the fact that, okay, like we coming from nothing, right? But what we do have, we're going to use it in a way to elevate ourselves as well as entertain ourselves, right? So if we know anything about Harlem in the 1920s and 30s, right, we know about the Cotton Club, or we know about the Civil Way, right? We know about just this sort of energy and sort of vivaciousness of the space, right? Black people dressed to the nines, rent parties, those kind of things, which are there to sustain, us in the in-between, right? It's how we gather. It's how we love on each other. It's how we fight each other too sometimes. But these are spaces where, we get to kind of release, right? So we're not necessarily thinking about, what the white man is doing or what oppression we're facing, right? We're just really interacting, and like I said, loving and being joyful with each other. So you see that start to come out in Harlem Renaissance painting. Again, just succinctly with Harlem Renaissance writing. So this is a piece by Archibald Motley that again demonstrates that busyness. It also demonstrates, again, Black economic mobility and stability. So prior to segregation, prior to integration, Black neighborhoods, the pharmacist was Black, the dry cleaners was Black, right? The hotel owner was Black, the grocery store owner was Black. Like we had our own everything. And we took care of each other in that way. The federal government ran the freeway systems through our neighborhoods in various cities that kind of ended that. So Detroit is actually dealing with that now with 375, right? But this is what our neighborhoods, this is what our communities looks like, right? And all their beauty and their ugliness too. So this is one of my favorite images by the preeminent Harlem Renaissance photographer, Black photographer, George Van Der Zee. I use this photo particularly because it's an image from Christie's. So it's actually an auction piece, so you can actually see, how much a photo like this went for in the early 2000s. Now, this particular photo, because it is such a famous and iconic image, you can find it anywhere from $25,000 to $35,000. But it is also a great representation. I wish I could, I could actually hear you, because I would ask if anybody knew what kind of car this was, if you could just kind of guess, right, what type of car this was. Well, anyway, it's a Cadillac. If you know anything about Black community, you know that a Cadillac was, and kind of still is, a status symbol for Black folks, throughout the 20th century. So this particular couple in their raccoon coats, in their 1932 Cadillac means, like, to a certain degree, I can't even put words to how important this is, and how important of an image, this is. Right. The other thing about this was that you did not have to stop, that your past doesn't necessarily, or like your sort of beginnings, right, don't necessarily have to define, who you become in life. Having that hope, right, and that understanding of oneself and of those around you were also very important, to Black people. So the other reason why Van Der Zee is included here in conversation with Toomer is because he actually had, like, costumes and backgrounds where Black people could dream, so you could actually set up, whatever type of scenario, you wanted to set up for yourself and create an image that you kept for yourself or that you shared with other people around you. So this idea, this activity, right, of just Black dreaming becomes so central, to not just Harlem Renaissance artists, but to American readers, right? And American art enthusiasts. And a lot of folks didn't know what they were looking at. A lot of people didn't even know what they were reading, right? But it's this way in which, in order, right, for us to survive, in order for us to kind of tap out of just how oppressed, right, and just how precarious, our lives can be because of how the system functions. This idea of Black dreaming, you may have heard the term, that's been popularized recently, of Afrofuturism, grows, from this time period, in the New Negro movement, a time period before, right? So this way that we have to envision our lives differently. We have to envision futures that don't exist for ourselves to actually make it to the futures that do. Is the celebration, right? I end with this slide because it's a typical Saturday night, right? Again, a moment to relax, a moment to enjoy the life that we are, and I guess I would say, like in my case, my grandparents, right, were able to create, for us in whatever way, right, or the best ways that we can actualize it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Morgan. So that leaves us a really great amount of time for us to do some questions and discussion. And we are getting a few things and a few comments and questions coming up. So if you're ready, we can move forward with that stage. Does it sound like a plan?
Yeah.
Yeah, let's do it. So the first question from one of our audience members is, what was the island in the migration series panel number 1, or Door of No Return?
Oh, so Lawrence isn't representing that particular island. He's referencing it, but the island is called Goree Island, Goree.
And then maybe, can you talk a little bit more about this island and kind of expand? I think that's what our question is kind of asking. Can you talk about that aspect and how it connects to the artwork? Yeah.
Yeah. So Goree Island, hold on. Was where one of the most prominent slave castles, was kept in what's now present day Senegal. And it has this really narrow door that kidnapped slaves were, or I should say enslaved, um, kidnapped Africans were funneled through, right? So they were funneled through on their backs, like straight into the bow of the slave ships. And can you like just imagine how horrifying something like that would feel like? You can visit, Goree Island today. Artist or contemporary artist Carrie Mae Weems has a whole series around the door of no return. And what Lawrence is really referencing is in the migration panel is now we are walking through our own doors, right? At the same volume, right? We're not being forced, so we can actually choose the door. Does that make sense?
Perfect sense. And that kind of connects to another question coming through that from our audience is, why these cities? Like, what was the attraction of Chicago, New York, St. Louis? And as we're getting to this island space, but then we see this great migration to what are now, incredible cities. But, at the time in this early presence, what was it about this that it was like, that's where we need to go?
Well, there were several things, primarily industrialization. Since we're Michiganders, right? Detroit becomes a really important place because of Henry Ford, right? So a little bit of background there. Ford, he had his issues, right? But he was one of the first industrialists to hire Black people, period, in very dangerous, right? And like, janitorial jobs. But he also eventually became the first of the big three to hire Black engineers. And a lot of this had to do with the fact that he was one of Booker T. Washington's primary funders for Tuskegee. So why is he funding Tuskegee? There was a man by the name of George Washington Carver who ran Tuskegee's mathematics and science departments, right? He was an amazing and just unbelievable, mind and inventor of himself, in and of himself. And Ford got a lot of his ideas from Dr. Carver, right? And in helping Henry Ford, he would ask Dr. Carver, then what do you want me to do? Or, you want me to pay you and this kind of thing. And Dr. Carver would always say, no, just give the money to Tuskegee, right? So Detroit becomes a very important place because Black people graduating from Tuskegee come to Detroit to work for Ford, right? You have a similar situation in Pittsburgh, right, which is a little earlier than this, where, folks are moving to Western Pennsylvania, right, Southeastern Ohio to work for Carnegie because you can't get paid for the work that you are doing in the South at all. Northern industrialists are also not stupid. So they know they lose their Eastern European labor force, right, to World War I. They're very aware, right, that it is a quote unquote, free labor force for them to choose from in the South in Black men. So they send recruiters, to the South to actually recruit not just Black men, but Black families, right, to these northern cities for work.
Yeah, that's really, it kind of confirms a lot of what social studies educators are sharing within classrooms and what I hear when I'm working with social studies educators. But I really love like the fact that we can connect it to this art piece, right? You can see this inquiry happening in the classroom, this discussion, particularly if we bring out a compelling question that's like, hey, what do you think of this, right? And seeing where kids will go. What's the significance of the names or the the way that the art is presenting itself? So that's great. Thanks. So our next question is, what is the significance of the sun setting in the east in the poem when it sets in the west?
I'm like, I actually do not know.
It's a good question. I was
That
like,
is a good
that's
question.
really interesting.
And I'm like, and as many times as I have taught this book and that poem, nobody's ever picked that up.
And again, like this is one of those moments we don't know the answer, and that is really fascinating. I wondered the same
if
thing.
if I took a stab at it, something that, and just knowing Toomer's biography. So something that was really like difficult for him was the backwardness of it all, right? The backwardness of like how race functions, not just in the South, but in the US. So again, like he writes Cain, he gets all of this critical acclaim. He never really writes again. Because despite the fact that he looks white and he has this access, the world knows he's a Black man, right? And he succumbs to that. So if I had to take a stab at like what that really means, it would be that, like the way that, systemic racism in the United States is such a backward, stupid, right, reality.
Yeah.
And it kind of snuffs the life, out of people, both Black and white, right? Who are subjected to it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you share several times throughout the presentation about how heavy, right? This content is heavy, and it really can take its toll, right? And the importance of artists to put that out there and express, both in a lot of these images being positive moments in many examples, but on the other hand too, really launching this into the public eye, like this is present, this is happening, this exists, how do we work through this? Here's the next question. What other mediums did artists use besides burlap and plywood for their paintings?
Oh, everything, canvas, cotton sheets. Think of the way in which even Black women, used old textiles, right, to make all types, not just quilting, right, but just to make all types of things, or painting, on fabric. So many of these artists that I'm talking about or that I've spoken about today were academically trained, right? So National Academy of Design, Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts. But you had tons of artists who were working at this time that are like referred to as folk artists, right? Who weren't traditionally trained. So someone like William Edmondson, is working in like the Nashville area in limestone, right? He's the first Black sculptor, really first Black artist to have a show at MoMA in 1930, right? I'm trying to think of of somebody else off the top of my head. Clementine Hunter, right? Where she's painting on anything she can kind of get in front of her, right? So they're using whatever's at their disposal, to illustrate, visualize, communicate the creative reality, or like I said, the creative lives of Black people.
Yeah, and I'm kind of smiling a little bit too, because as the questions are coming in, Dr. Morgan, yourself and I talked yesterday in kind of a debrief, getting ready about how important this art is, and so we must have a lot of visual learners in our presentation with us today, because there's a lot of thank yous, like thanks for the photography and the images, this is great. But I think that really is right. This is something we can touch, we can feel. It's right there. Like, and I think with students, this really connects amazingly when it gets to the history and cultural understandings around this space. Okay, here's our next question, a really great one. So this individual asked, were there prominent African American female photographers during this time frame, and who might they be in order to put in the classroom and in front of kids to explore?
So actually, no, right? But what I can tell you is that there were 4 Black female sculptors, right? So in the field, both as in American art as well as African American art, we've mulled over this for a number of years, like my colleagues and I, and wondering about that, like what was it about sculpture? So there was Emonia Lewis, who was the only Native and African American female neoclassical sculptress. She worked from about 1850 up through, well, she passed in the early 1900s, but up through like the 1890s. And then you had May Howard Jackson and Meta Work Fuller. So Jackson and Fuller were classmates of Laura Wheeler Waring, right? The painter that I showed earlier. And then you had a woman by the name of Nancy Elizabeth Prophet. And Nancy Prophet was born in Rhode Island, like Providence, Rhode Island. She was a teacher at Spelman, along with Hale Woodruff. So this is the other thing about the Harlem Renaissance artists. Most of them went into the HBCUs right after the Depression, and they taught there. Another name that I can give you, not a photographer, but she was a textile designer and another like sort of virtuoso painter, was Lois Mailou Jones. And then of course Augusta Savage, right, who was the preeminent Black female sculptor of the Harlem Renaissance, but taught mostly. So Augusta Savage was Jacob Lawrence's teacher, and unfortunately didn't cast a lot of her work. So not a ton of photographers, but like I said, about 4 or 5, sculptors.
Oh, that's really cool. So keep a kind of a 2-part question. A big thank you to you. And the images that you selected are amazing. So the first part of the question is, what made you select the specific artwork selections for this discussion? And then the second part is, were there any other pieces that you would have liked to have added, artwork that you would have included as well?
Yeah, so okay, my little secret here is that as much as I have been a curator, I'm also a professor. So this is actually a lecture that I give in my Harlem Renaissance seminar course. And typically, for grad students, I teach it on the undergraduate level too. So Rochelle, to your question, these particular, like I put this all together because in just teaching the poetry, these Gen Zers, right, younger millennials, they're visual learners, right? Because TikTok, YouTube, Instagram, right? So it was how I was able to make the poetry and to make the short stories come alive for them, right? Because a text like Cain, has all of this like beautiful language, right? But no images. And so I was like, well, there's tons of paintings, and tons of works on paper by Black artists who were actually, Toomer's contemporaries that I can show. So to your second question, oh my God, yeah, there's like so many more that I teach in this unit as, together. So this was me kind of truncating it for your purposes today. And just, trying to demonstrate, like, again, like I said, there's more happening with the writers themselves. But I think in the time period as a whole.
Yeah, I would imagine it was like, what do I pull from? This is so great, and this is so great, and this is so, I could imagine. And then kind of a connector to that too is to the Wright Museum, and coming from the lens of the teacher. And are these pieces available in the Wright Museum if we're to access it and have the opportunity for students to learn from the Wright Museum? And then maybe as a secondary, now I'm just kind of adding to, how would I best utilize the Wright Museum as a teacher and for my students to explore?
So for first and foremost, our core exhibition in Still We Rise is the quintessential, Black narrative. It's the Darlene Clark Hine narrative, the African American Odyssey narrative. Hine is the author of like the official sort of African American history textbook. And which is a not K through 12, Jesus, 11th grade, 12th grade, and then, God, freshman year, sophomore year, right? So intro to African American history. That text is pretty much our core exhibit, like to the T. So if you're looking, it takes about an hour 15, to get through our core exhibition. It's a little dated now, but we're working on that. But it's still, the narrative is still pretty much pre-colonial Africa, right, to present day. So that's one thing. For the works, we don't actually own the works that I showed here. But the DIA does. The DIA has a amazing collection of African American art from the 19th century to the present. And they do have, Jacob Lawrence works. They do have William H. Johnson works as well. The largest collection of William H. Johnson works is actually at the Smithsonian Museum of American Art. So if you're ever taking a trip to DC, you could go there, and see the works. Here, I would have to pull them out of storage. We have a lot of work of the time period from Detroit artists, right? So that's where, the Wright really is a gem, and it's important in that way because our collection really represents Detroit as emblematic of a much more national phenomenon.
Yeah, I love that answer. And so in a connector to that too, when we're using these works, particularly art as primary sources, and analyzing the artwork from a historical perspective, what guiding questions and or structures might you suggest when putting this in the classrooms? What types of questions should we be either constructing with students or maybe even, putting out for students for them to have this real inquiry, explorative experience?
I think, part of it could start with, have they traveled to the South? What is their understanding, of the South? Like in terms of just basic, right? Kind of general questions, what are their understandings of the South? What are their understandings of US history pre-civil rights? Is there a sense, of Black visual culture, right? Or Black visual expression, prior to like what they know, and what they've engaged on social media. Other, exploratory questions could be, in reading a book like Cain, could you recognize or do you recognize things that, maybe your grandmother has on her mantle, right? Or maybe mom has in a china cabinet, right? Is there a photo album somewhere, right? When you go to your grandmother's house that could, that could reflect, some of the stories that Toomer is telling. For me, even my white students, Asian students, Latinx students too, when you can connect the work to something that they recognize and to something that they know and they've kind of held as this kind of like household thing or, just kind of quotidian, right, everyday thing, they light up like Christmas trees. Because it's one of those, and not all of them, right? But they may come, they come into the classroom and again, these are grad students and undergrads, in my experience. And it's like, none of this stuff matters, Dr. Morgan, and all this stuff is old, and then when you draw those connections to things that they're engaging today, right? They're like, oh, and they do, and they take to it primarily because sometimes it's new. It's like nobody's actually, like they haven't been introduced, to something like, I teach Cain primarily because the lyricism is so beautiful. And hip hop is such a foundational, right, tool for the last, 2.5, 3 generations. Right. So that's another thing. It's like where you can make the connection between the lyricism and poetry, to a type of lyricism or a type of auditory poetry that they have known their entire lives. Right. That may not necessarily always be beautiful, right? But it's how they hear. So it's that, kind of taking those type of deep dives, right? Like connecting beyond just what's on the page.
I love it. So the next question, this is just like, thanks. We're eating this up, Dr. Morgan. We are like, this is great. So next question coming through is, are there any novels that you would recommend that coincide with the work that you're sharing today?
Oh my God, yeah. Sterling Brown's poetry, any collection. I mean, because now you can get Harlem Renaissance readers where like everything is in, one text for you. Zora Neale Hurston's, Their Eyes Are Watching God is one of the other. I think that's probably the other like Harlem Renaissance text. Really, I should say really popular Harlem Renaissance text outside of Kane. James Weldon Johnson's The Autobiography of an Ex-Colored Man. Jesse Fawcett's Plum Bun. Any collection, right, of Langston Hughes poems, from this era. And County Cullen, Wallace Thurman, Gwendolyn Bennett. Right, those are just, again, I'm just throwing the authors' names out. And they have novels, short stories, and poems. Something that'll kind of get you like the twofer to get you sort of all for one is the Norton Anthology of African American Literature. Right, it's a 2-volume set, and it gets you everything from the spirituals to, again, present day writing, by like Kiese Layman. And it is like the whole breadth of African American literary history, represented in 2 texts, but 1 volume.
Yeah, I think you just completely listed out our future reading list for pretty much everyone on the on the webinar. So that's completely fantastic. So we're most definitely getting a lot of thank yous for your work, your presentation. So we can't thank you enough for this work. So we're going to, if it's okay at this point, I think we have questioned you out, Dr. Morgan, and that we're really coming closer to our time here. So we really appreciate you sharing your knowledge with us, and really providing the work and the expertise, these amazing visual presentations that reflect culture of this time. And really guiding us on how students can explore this space to be learners of our past. So thank you for being with us today.